the sleepy village of Little Paddocks, a veiled widow, Mrs. Lavinia Crane, arrives with whispers of wealth and a shadowy past. When a silver chalice vanishes from the church, Miss Jane Marple's keen eyes see beyond the gossip. A cryptic letter warns of danger, a limping stranger lurks, and a scheming clerk hides secrets. As tension builds, Miss Marple unravels a web of blackmail and greed, setting a midnight trap to expose the truth. Will she lift the widow's veil before the shadow strikes? Discover a classic mystery where no secret escapes her gaze. Chapter 1. The Shadow in Little Paddocks. The village of Little Paddocks lay drowsing under the pale October sun, its thatched cottages and winding lanes exuding an air of timeless serenity. Ivy clung to stone walls, and the scent of wood smoke drifted from chimneys, mingling with the crisp bite of autumn. In her modest cottage on Primrose Lane, Miss Jane Marple sat by her bay window, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of a metronome. Her hands, delicate but sure, worked a soft grey wool, yet her eyes, bright and sharp as a bird's, scanned the village beyond her lace curtains. Little happened in Little Paddocks that escaped Miss Marple's notice. For weeks the village had buzzed with talk of a newcomer. Mrs. Lavinia Crane, a widow of uncertain age, had taken up residence at Willow Cottage, a charming but secluded house at the edge of the village. She arrived in a sleek black car, her face shrouded by a heavy velvet veil, her mourning attire as elegant as it was impenetrable. The villagers, ever eager for novelty, speculated freely. Some said she was a London heiress, her fortune amassed through a husband's untimely demise. Others whispered of tragedy, perhaps a scandal left behind in the city. Miss Marple, however, reserved judgment. She had seen many newcomers in her time, and she knew that appearances were often the least reliable of clues. That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with her friend Mrs. Lucy Adams, whose bustling energy filled her cosy parlour. Lucy, a stout woman with a penchant for gossip, poured from a chip teapot as she shared the latest tidings. "They say Mrs. Crane's husband was a financier, Jane, and left her pots of money. But why come here to Little Paddocks? It's hardly the place for a woman of her sort." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "And that veil! Clara Finch swears she's hiding a scar, or worse." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression mild. "Clara Finch is an observant woman, but imagination can outpace observation. A veil may hide grief, Lucy, or it may hide something else entirely." Her tone was gentle, but her mind was already turning over the fragments of village talk. A wealthy widow, a veiled face, a sudden arrival, these were threads, and Miss Marple was adept at weaving them into patterns. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, settling once more by her window. The light was fading, casting long shadows across the lane. Her needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to her thoughts. Then, as the church clock struck 6, she saw it. A figure in a dark coat, collar turned up against the evening chill, moving swiftly along the hedgerow toward Willow Cottage. The figure paused at the gate, glancing about before slipping inside. Miss Marple's hands stilled. The movement was furtive, practiced as though the visitor wished to avoid notice. She made a mental note of the coat's cut and the slight stoop of the shoulders. "Curious," she murmured, resuming her knitting. The next morning, the village postmistress, Miss Clara Finch, called at Miss Marple's cottage with a basket of apples from her garden. Clara, whose sharp tongue was matched only by her sharper ears, could not resist sharing her latest gleanings. "I saw lights in Willow Cottage late last night, Miss Marple, past midnight, and Mrs. Adams says Mrs. Crane ordered a crate of wine from London. Fancy stuff, not like what we get at the Red Lion." Clara's eyes gleamed with the thrill of conjecture. "What's a widow need with all that wine, alone in that big house?" Miss Marple offered a polite smile, slicing an apple with care. "Perhaps she enjoys her solitude, Clara, or perhaps she expects company." Her tone was light, but her mind catalogued the details. Late-night lights, expensive wine, a mysterious visitor. Clara chattered on, oblivious to the old lady's quiet scrutiny, but Miss Marple was already piecing together a puzzle whose shape was not yet clear. That evening, as the village settled into its quiet routines, Miss Marple took her customary stroll along Primrose Lane. The air was cool, and the first stars pricked the sky. Passing Willow Cottage, she noted its drawn curtains and the faint glow of a single lamp within. No sound emerged, no hint of the wine or the visitor. Yet Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing human nature, told her that Mrs. Lavinia Crane was no ordinary widow. The velvet veil, the shadowed figure, the whispers of wealth, they were all clues, and Miss Marple knew that clues, like her knitting, required patience to unravel. She turned homeward, her step unhurried, her mind alight with possibilities. Chapter 2. The Dinner at Willow Cottage. The invitation to Willow Cottage arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning, delivered by hand to a select few in little paddocks. Mrs. Lavinia Crane, it seemed, wished to introduce herself properly to the village, and a dinner party was her chosen means. Miss Jane Marple, folding the embossed card with its elegant script, noted the widow's determination to quell gossip, or perhaps to shape it. She adjusted her shawl, her mind already sifting through the implications. A dinner, after all, was not merely a meal. It was a stage, and Miss Marple was keen to observe the players. Willow Cottage glowed warmly that evening, its windows casting golden light across the frosted lawn. The house, with its low eaves and climbing roses, seemed an unlikely setting for intrigue, yet Miss Marple's instincts told her otherwise. She arrived punctually, her black lace dress understated but impeccable, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. The other guests were already assembling. Colonel Henry Bantry, a bluff retired military man with a penchant for local history. Dr. Philip Haydock, the village physician, whose quiet demeanour belied a sharp mind. Miss Clara Finch, the postmistress, whose curiosity was as notorious as her efficiency, and Mr. Edwin Turner, a young solicitor's clerk with slicked hair and an air of ambition that bordered on impudence. Mrs. Crane greeted them at the door, her figure swathed in black silk, her face still half hidden by the velvet veil. The veil, Miss Marple noted, was thinner tonight, allowing glimpses of a pale cheek and dark, expressive eyes. The widow's voice was low and cultured, tinged with a nervousness that did not escape Miss Marple's attention. "I am so pleased you could come," Mrs. Crane said, ushering them into a dining room set with gleaming silver and crystal. The table was a study in elegance, from the starched linen to the centerpiece of white lilies, their scent heavy in the air. As they took their seats, Colonel Bantry launched into a hearty anecdote about a fox hunt, his voice filling the room. Miss Marple, seated opposite Mrs. Crane, observed the widow's hands. Slender, adorned with a single sapphire ring, but restless, twisting her napkin as the Colonel spoke. Dr. Haydock, to her left, ate sparingly, his gaze flickering toward their hostess with professional concern. Miss Clara Finch, meanwhile, chattered about the weather, her eyes darting to every detail of the room. The heavy curtains, the locked cabinet in the corner, the portrait of a stern-faced man above the fireplace. "Your late husband, Mrs. Crane," Clara ventured, her tone innocent but probing. Mrs. Crane's hand stilled. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That is Charles. He was a private man." The answer was curt, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her fingers as she reached for her wine-glass. The ruby liquid caught the candlelight, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Edwin Turner, seated at the far end, leaned forward, his smile sharp. "A financier, wasn't he? I hear he had quite the knack for investments. Must have left you well provided for, Mrs. Crane." The widow's eyes flashed, though the veil softened their intensity. "My husband's affairs were his own, Mr. Turner," she said, her tone icy. "I prefer to leave the past where it lies." The rebuke hung in the air, and Edwin's cheeks flushed, though his smile remained. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, catalogued the exchange. The young man's boldness suggested more than curiosity. It hinted at knowledge, perhaps leverage. She made a mental note to inquire about his work at the shoe solicitor's office. The conversation turned, as village conversations often did, to local matters. Colonel Bantry, between bites of roasted pheasant, mentioned a recent disturbance at the vicarage. "A silver chalice gone missing after Sunday service," he said, shaking his head. "Not worth much, mind you, but a dashed nuisance. The vicar's quite put out." Miss Marple's spoon paused mid-air. A theft, however small, was a thread worth pulling. She glanced at Mrs. Crane, whose hand tightened on her glass, the knuckles whitening briefly before she set it down. "How distressing," the widow murmured, her voice steady but her eyes averted. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "Theft is rare in little paddocks," he said, "likely some passing tramp, though I heard talk of a stranger near the church that night." His words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the glance he exchanged with Clara Finch, who nodded eagerly. "I saw him myself," Clara interjected, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A man in a dark coat, skulking by the lich gate. Most suspicious." Miss Marple's mind flickered to the figure she had seen slipping into Willow Cottage. A coincidence, perhaps, but she distrusted coincidences. As the meal progressed to dessert, a delicate lemon souffle, the atmosphere grew strained. Edwin Turner, undeterred by his earlier rebuff, pressed Mrs. Crane again, this time about her plans in Little Paddocks. "A quiet village must feel a world away from London's bustle," he said, his tone smooth but edged. "Do you intend to stay long?" Mrs. Crane's smile was tight. "As long as it suits me, Mr. Turner." The reply was polite but final, and Miss Marple noted the young man's jaw tighten, his eyes narrowing as he leaned back in his chair. Coffee was served in the drawing-room, where a fire crackled in the grate. Miss Marple, settling into an armchair, observed the group's dynamics. Colonel Bantry, now engrossed in a discussion of cricket with Dr. Haydock, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents. Clara Finch, however, hovered near Mrs. Crane, her questions veiled as pleasantries but relentless. "Such a lovely home," Clara said, peering at the locked cabinet. "Do you collect curios, Mrs. Crane?" The widow's response was vague, and Miss Marple noted the way her hand brushed the sapphire ring, as if for reassurance. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple lingered by the door, thanking her hostess. Mrs. Crane's handshake was cool, her smile polite but distant. "I hope to see you again, Miss Marple," she said, but her eyes were elsewhere, scanning the darkened garden beyond the window. Miss Marple followed her gaze, catching the faintest movement in the shadows. A rustle of leaves, perhaps, or something more. She said nothing, but her mind was alert. Walking home under a starlit sky, Miss Marple reflected on the evening. The theft of the chalice, the stranger in the dark coat, Mrs. Crane's guarded demeanour, Edwin Turner's probing questions. Each was a piece of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was adept at fitting such pieces together. She recalled her nephew Raymond's fondness for detective novels, with their tidy solutions, but real life, she knew, was messier. Yet it followed patterns, and human nature was as predictable as her knitting. As she reached her cottage, the church clock chimed 10, and Miss Marple paused, her thoughts settling on the widow in the velvet veil. Something was amiss at Willow Cottage, and she intended to find out what. Chapter 3. The Clue in the Churchyard. The morning mist hung low over Little Paddocks, softening the outlines of the church spire and the huddled gravestones in the churchyard. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen coat and a sensible hat, made her way along the cobbled path to St. Michael's, her basket swinging lightly at her side. She had mentioned to Mrs. Lucy Adams her intention to tend her aunt's grave, a task that required no explanation in a village where such duties were commonplace. Yet Miss Marple's purpose was twofold. The churchyard, she knew, was a place where secrets sometimes surfaced, as much among the living as the dead. The air was damp, carrying the scent of moss and fallen leaves. As she knelt by the weathered stone of her aunt's grave, arranging a small posy of chrysanthemums, Miss Marple's eyes roamed the surroundings. The churchyard was quiet, save for the distant caw of a rook and the faint clatter of a cart on the high street. Then, from behind a yew tree, emerged Miss Clara Finch, her face flushed and her usual composure frayed. In her hand, she clutched a crumpled envelope, its edges worn as though handled repeatedly. "Miss Marple!" Clara exclaimed, hurrying over. "You'll never believe what I found this morning." Her voice, though hushed, trembled with excitement. "It was in the post-box outside the shop, just lying there. No address, no stamp. I couldn't help but look." She thrust the envelope toward Miss Marple, who took it with a calm nod, her fingers tracing the rough paper. The letter inside was written in a hasty, uneven scrawl. "The chalice is not what it seems. Beware the widow's shadow." The words were stark, their meaning cryptic, yet they sent a shiver through Miss Marple's thoughts, not of fear but of clarity. A warning, perhaps, or a taunt. "Most peculiar," Miss Marple said, folding the letter and slipping it into her reticule. "Have you shown this to anyone else, Clara?" The postmistress shook her head vigorously. "Not a soul. I came straight here after opening the shop. It's unsettling, isn't it? Do you think it's about Mrs. Crane?" Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of scandal, but Miss Marple's response was measured. "It may be, or it may not. Anonymous letters are often more about the writer than the subject." Clara frowned, clearly hoping for more, but Miss Marple only smiled. "Thank you for sharing this, Clara. I shall keep it in mind." Bidding Clara goodbye, Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, her gaze drifting to the path leading to the vicarage. The theft of the silver chalice, mentioned at Mrs. Crane's dinner, had piqued her curiosity. She made her way to the vicarage, where the Reverend Mr. Clement welcomed her with his usual geniality. A thin man with a scholarly stoop, he ushered her into his study, where books and papers were strewn across a cluttered desk. The chalice, he sighed when Miss Marple raised the subject, was not valuable in coin, but it meant a great deal to us. A gift from my predecessor, you know, blessed during the church's centenary. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes noting the open window and the garden beyond, where the earth was soft from recent rain. Was anything else disturbed? She asked. Mr. Clement shook his head. Nothing, as far as I can tell. The thief was precise, which makes it all the odder. Miss Marple's mind turned to the letter. A chalice of little worth, yet significant enough to steal, and to warn about. Might I see where it was kept? She inquired. The vicar led her to the small sacristy, where a wooden cupboard stood, its lock scratched but intact. It was here, he said, pointing to an empty velvet-lined box. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the scratches, fresh and deliberate, suggesting haste rather than skill. As they stepped outside, she noticed something else. Footprints in the damp soil near the churchyard gate, leading toward the lane that wound past Willow Cottage. They were small, perhaps a woman's, but pressed deeply, as though the bearer carried a burden. She filed this away, her face betraying nothing. Returning to the churchyard, Miss Marple paused by the gate, her fingers brushing the cold iron. The footprints, the letter, the chalice, they formed a constellation of clues, each pointing to Willow Cottage and its enigmatic occupant. She recalled Mrs. Crane's trembling hand at dinner, the way her veil had shifted under the candlelight, revealing not just a face, but a flicker of fear. The widow's shadow, the letter had warned. Was it Mrs. Crane herself, or someone lurking in her orbit? As she walked home, the mist began to lift, revealing the village in sharp relief. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, remained clouded with possibilities. The letter's author could be anyone. A villager with a grudge, a conspirator with a motive, or even the stranger in the dark coach she had glimpsed outside Willow Cottage. She considered Clara Finch's eagerness to share the letter. The postmistress was observant, but her love of gossip made her an unreliable filter. No, Miss Marple would trust her own observations, honed by years of watching human nature unfold in quiet places like little paddocks. At her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting untouched as she unfolded the letter once more. But the handwriting was unfamiliar. The ink smudged in places, suggesting haste or agitation. The chalice is not what it seems, she murmured, her voice soft in the stillness. In her experience, objects of apparent insignificance often held the key to greater truths. A chalice, a veil, a shadow. Each was a thread in a tapestry she was beginning to discern. She would visit Mrs. Crane again, she decided, perhaps under the guise of returning a borrowed book. The widow's reaction to the letter, if shown, might reveal more than words. As the church clock struck noon, Miss Marple tucked the letter away, her mind as clear and sharp as the autumn air. Little paddocks might appear tranquil, but beneath its surface ran currents of unease. She thought of her friend Dolly Bantry, who loved a good mystery novel, but Miss Marple knew that real mysteries were less tidy, their solutions rooted in the frailties of the human heart. She rose, adjusting her hat, and stepped out into the village, her step light but purposeful. The churchyard had yielded its first clue, and Miss Marple was determined to find the next. Chapter 4. The Stranger in the Lane. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Daffodil Lane, where the hedgerows glowed with the last of the season's blackberries. Miss Jane Marple, her basket hooked over one arm, walked with her usual unhurried gait, her eyes taking in the familiar contours of little paddocks. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying a constitutional, but her mind was as active as ever, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that had begun to form. The stolen chalice, the cryptic letter, and the veiled widow at Willow Cottage. Her stroll, though seemingly aimless, had a purpose: to pass by the cottage and observe what might be seen. As she neared the lane's bend, where Willow Cottage's garden wall met the road, Miss Marple's attention sharpened. There, half hidden by the tangle of hawthorn, stood a man in a dark coat, his hat pulled low over his brow. He lingered near the cottage gate, his posture tense, as though poised to move but reluctant to be seen. Miss Marple slowed her pace, feigning interest in a cluster of late-blooming roses. The man's left leg dragged slightly as he shifted his weight, a limp unmistakable even at a distance. She recalled the figure she had glimpsed slipping into Willow Cottage under cover of dusk, and her suspicions deepened. This was no casual passer-by. Before she could approach, the man glanced over his shoulder, his face obscured by the hat's brim, and melted into the hedgerows with a practiced stealth. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She made a mental note of his height, average perhaps, and the worn cuffs of his coat, suggesting a man of limited means or deliberate inconspicuousness. The limp, however, was the detail that anchored itself in her mind. It was a clue as distinct as a fingerprint, and she would not forget it. Continuing her walk, Miss Marple turned her thoughts to Mrs. Lavinia Crane. The widow's guarded demeanour at the dinner party, her trembling hand when the chalice was mentioned, and the locked cabinet in her dining room all suggested a woman with secrets. The stranger, Miss Marple reasoned, was likely connected to those secrets. Was he a threat, a confederate, or something else entirely? She recalled the anonymous letter Clara Finch had found. "Beware the widow's shadow." The phrase echoed in her mind, its meaning still elusive, but increasingly ominous. At tea that afternoon, Miss Marple called on Dr. Philip Haydock, whose modest surgery doubled as his home. The doctor, a lean man with a quiet intensity, welcomed her into his parlour, where medical journals lay neatly stacked beside a teapot. Over cups of Earl Grey, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward Mrs. Crane. "She seems a delicate sort," she remarked, her tone light. "I suppose you've seen her professionally?" Dr. Haydock nodded, his expression guarded. "She consulted me shortly after arriving. Nerves mostly. I prescribed a mild sedative, but she's reluctant to discuss her troubles." Miss Marple's knitting needles, brought along as a matter of habit, clicked softly in her lap. "Nerves can stem from many causes," she said. "Grief, perhaps, or fear." The doctor's eyes met hers, and for a moment she sensed he knew more than he was willing to say. "She's a private woman," he replied, "but I've no doubt she's had her share of burdens." Miss Marple smiled, her mind noting his careful choice of words. A private woman indeed, but privacy could be a shield or a mask. As she left the surgery, the village was settling into its evening hush, the sky streaked with pink and gold. Miss Marple's path took her past the Red Lion, where the clink of glasses and the murmur of voices spilled into the street. Pausing to adjust her scarf, she overheard a snippet of conversation from two labourers at the pub's doorway. "That Turner lad's been flashing coin lately," one muttered. "Drinks all round last night, like he's come into money." The other chuckled. "Solicitor's clerk, my foot. He's up to something, mark my words." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her interest quickened. Edwin Turner, with his bold questions at the dinner party, was another thread in the tapestry. That evening, a sudden disturbance shattered the village's calm. A piercing scream echoed from the direction of Willow Cottage, sharp enough to halt Miss Marple's knitting mid-stitch. She rose, pulling on her coat, and joined a small knot of villagers hurrying toward the source. At Willow Cottage, they found Mrs. Crane standing in her doorway, her veil discarded, but her face pale as moonlight. "I saw someone," she gasped, clutching the door frame. "A face at the window, staring in. It was horrible." Her voice broke, and Dr. Haydock, who had arrived moments before, guided her to a chair. Colonel Bantry, summoned by the commotion, took charge with military efficiency. "Likely a poacher, or some village lad playing a prank," he declared, though his tone lacked conviction. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the background, noted the widow's trembling hands and the way her eyes darted to the darkened windows. The villagers whispered of ghosts or vagrants, but Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the limping man in the dark coat. A prankster would not linger so cautiously, nor vanish so swiftly. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Crane, her voice gentle. "You must have had a dreadful fright, my dear. Did you recognize the face?" The widow shook her head, her fingers twisting the sapphire ring on her hand. "No, it was too dark, but it felt familiar somehow." Her words were halting, and Miss Marple sensed a truth half-spoken. She offered a reassuring pat, her mind racing. Familiarity suggested a connection, perhaps to the stranger in the lane or to the widow's past in London. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the anonymous letter resting on the table beside her. The scream, the stranger, the chalice. And Mrs. Crane's fear formed a pattern, though its edges remained blurred. She thought of her old friend Sir Henry Clithering, who often marvelled at her ability to see through the fog of human motives. "It's like knitting, Sir Henry," she had once told him. "One stitch at a time, and the shape emerges." Tonight, the shape was still indistinct, but Miss Marple was patient. She would watch and listen and wait for the next stitch to fall into place. Tomorrow, she decided, she would call on Mr. Clement again, to inquire about the footprints near the vicarage. For now, she picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the quiet, as little paddocks slept under a watchful moon. Chapter 5. The Solicitor's Secret. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the parlour floor. She sat with a cup of tea, her knitting idle for once, as her mind sifted through the events of the previous evening. The scream from Willow Cottage, Mrs. Crane's pale face, and the fleeting glimpse of a limping man in a dark coat. These were not isolated incidents, she knew, but threads in a web whose centre remained elusive. Her thoughts turned to Edwin Turner, the solicitor's clerk, whose bold questions at Mrs. Crane's dinner and recent extravagance at the Red Lion suggested more than youthful ambition. Today, Miss Marple decided she would pursue that thread. under the pretext of updating her will, a plausible excuse for an elderly spinster, she made her way to the office of Mr. Giles, the village solicitor, whose small practice occupied a narrow building on the high street. The office smelled of ink and old paper, its walls lined with leather-bound ledgers. Mr. Giles, a portly man with a distracted air, greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure. Nothing wrong, I hope." His tone was jovial, but his eyes darted to the pile of documents on his desk, betraying a man perpetually behind schedule. Miss Marple smiled, settling into a creaking chair. "Oh, nothing urgent, Mr. Giles. Just a small matter of my will, adding a bequest for my nephew's children, you know." As he rummaged for her file, she steered the conversation toward Edwin Turner. "Your young clerk seems a bright lad," she remarked. "Ambitious, I imagine." Mr. Giles chuckled, but there was a hint of exasperation in his voice. "Too ambitious, perhaps. Edwin's capable, but he's been careless lately, misplacing papers, staying out late. And he's been handling Mrs. Crane's affairs, which are complicated." "Complicated?" Miss Marple's tone was innocent, her eyes keen. Mr. Giles hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Her late husband's estate is substantial, but there are irregularities, debts, investments, that sort of thing. Edwin's been sorting it out, but he's too curious for his own good. Asks too many questions, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the word irregularities. A fortune with shadows, perhaps, much like the widow herself. Leaving the office, Miss Marple paused on the high street, her gaze drifting toward the Red Lion. The labourers' gossip about Edwin's newfound wealth lingered in her thoughts. A clerk's salary, even in a prosperous village like Little Paddocks, did not account for drinks all round at the pub. She decided to take a detour, her steps leading her to the alley behind the Red Lion, where deliveries were made and secrets sometimes overheard. The alley was narrow, its cobbles slick with morning dew, and as she approached, she heard voices, low, urgent and unmistakably male. Peering cautiously around a stack of empty crates, Miss Marple saw Edwin Turner, his slicked hair slightly dishevelled, arguing with a man in a dark coat. The man's hat was pulled low, but his limp was unmistakable, the same stranger she had seen near Willow Cottage. "You'll get your share," Edwin hissed, his voice sharp with frustration. "But keep quiet, or we're both done for." The limping man's reply was inaudible, his gesture a quick jab of a finger toward Edwin's chest. Then, as if sensing a presence, he turned and slipped away, leaving Edwin to wipe his brow and hurry back towards the pub. Miss Marple retreated silently, her heart steady but her mind alight. Blackmail, she thought, or something very like it. Edwin's role in Mrs. Crane's legal affairs gave him access to sensitive information, perhaps leverage he was using to his advantage. The limping man, with his furtive visits to Willow Cottage, was likely his accomplice or his target. She recalled the anonymous letter's warning about the widow's shadow. Was Edwin casting that shadow, or was he entangled in it? That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Lucy Adams, whose parlour was a hub of village news. Over scones and jam, Lucy shared the latest gossip. "They say Edwin Turner's been seen with a new watch. Gold, if you please," she exclaimed. "And him just a clerk. Where's he getting the money, I'd like to know?" Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her thoughts raced. A gold watch, like drinks at the Red Lion, suggested sudden wealth, and sudden wealth often came with strings attached. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the anonymous letter before her. The chalice theft, the stranger's limp, Edwin's behaviour, and Mrs. Crane's fear formed a pattern, though its edges were still indistinct. She thought of her niece Mabel, who loved to speculate about motives in her book club. But Miss Marple knew motives were simpler than fiction allowed. Greed, fear, revenge. Edwin's ambition and the limping man's secrecy pointed to the first, but Mrs. Crane's role remained unclear. Was she victim or conspirator? To test her theory, Miss Marple resolved to observe Edwin more closely. She would attend the village whist drive tomorrow, where he was sure to appear, his sociable nature a mask for whatever he was hiding. She also planned to speak with Colonel Bantry about the chalice, to learn if any new clues had surfaced. For now, she picked up her knitting, the needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts. The solicitor's secret, she sensed, was a key to the mystery, and Miss Marple was determined to turn it. Chapter 6. The Unveiling. The village fete was in full swing, transforming the green of little paddocks into a kaleidoscope of colour and sound. Bunting fluttered between ancient oaks, stalls brimmed with homemade jams and knitted scarves, and children darted through the crowd, clutching toffee apples. Miss Jane Marple, stationed at the tea stall with Mrs. Lucy Adams, poured steaming cups for flushed villagers, her mild demeanour belying the keen observation she brought to every glance. The fete, with its mingling of familiar faces and unguarded moments, was a perfect stage for secrets to slip, and Miss Marple was ready to catch them. Mrs. Lavinia Crane's presence caused a stir. For the first time since her arrival, she appeared without her velvet veil, her face revealed to the village's eager scrutiny. Her beauty was striking, high cheekbones, dark eyes that held a guarded depth, and a cascade of chestnut hair pinned elegantly beneath a modest hat. Yet Miss Marple noted the tension in her posture, the way her finger clasped her handbag, as if anchoring herself against the crowd's curiosity. Mrs. Crane moved among the stalls with a practiced grace, pausing to admire a quilt or exchange pleasantries. But her smiles were fleeting, her gaze darting to the edges of the green. Miss Marple, handing a cup of tea to a farmer's wife, kept Mrs. Crane in her peripheral vision. Widow's unveiled face was a statement, perhaps a bid for acceptance, but it also exposed her vulnerability. The anonymous letter's warning, "Beware the widow's shadow," echoed in Miss Marple's mind. Was the shadow Mrs. Crane's past, or someone stalking it? The limping man in the dark coat had not appeared today, but Miss Marple sensed his presence lingering in the widow's unease. As the afternoon wore on, Colonel Henry Bantry took to the makeshift stage, his booming voice cutting through the chatter. "Good people of Little Paddocks," he announced, "I've news to share. The vicarage chalice, stolen last week, has been found." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "It was hidden in a hollow tree near the churchyard, wrapped in a sack. The vicar's delighted, though we're no closer to catching the culprit." The villagers buzzed with speculation, but Miss Marple's eyes were on Mrs. Crane. The widow's expression remained serene, her lips curving in a polite smile, but there was no surprise in her eyes, only a flicker of something like relief. Miss Marple excused herself from the tea stall, her basket over her arm, and made her way toward the cake stall, where Mrs. Crane was examining a Victoria sponge. "A fine day for the fete, Mrs. Crane," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but probing. "You must be pleased to hear about the chalice." The widow's eyes met hers, steady but guarded. "Very pleased," she replied. "It's good to know the village can return to normal." Her voice was smooth, but Miss Marple detected a strain, as if the words were rehearsed. She nodded, letting the moment pass, but her mind catalogued the widow's composure as a clue in itself. The fete continued with games and laughter, but Miss Marple's attention shifted to Edwin Turner, who lounged near the coconut shy, his gold watch glinting in the sunlight. His easy charm drew a small crowd of young women, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward Mrs. Crane, a calculating glint beneath his smile. She recalled his heated exchange with the limping man behind the Red Lion, his promise of a share if silence was kept. Edwin's ambition, she suspected, was a thread tied to the widow's fortune, and perhaps to the chalice's theft. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the green, Miss Marple found a quiet moment to approach Mrs. Crane. Under the guise of offering a scone, she drew the widow aside, her voice gentle but direct. "The chalice's return must be a relief," she said, "but I wonder if it was merely a distraction." Mrs. Crane's hand tightened on her handbag, her eyes narrowing slightly. "A distraction?" she echoed, her tone cautious. Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "Sometimes small thefts mask larger intentions. You've had your share of troubles, I imagine, coming to a new place." The widow's composure faltered, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. After a moment, she sighed, her shoulders sagging. "You're perceptive, Miss Marple," she said softly. "My husband, Charles, was not what he seemed. His business dealings were not always honest, and after his death, I found myself pursued by those he owed. I came to Little Paddocks to escape, but one of them followed me, a man from his past. He's been watching, demanding money." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was alert. "A man with a limp, perhaps?" she asked gently. Mrs. Crane's gaze snapped to hers, fear flashing in her eyes before she nodded. "Yes, he's been to the cottage, leaving notes, threatening to expose things. The chalice, I think it was his doing, a way to frighten me." Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. The limping man, the anonymous letter, the chalice's theft, all pointed to a campaign of intimidation with Mrs. Crane at its centre. But Edwin Turner's role remained unclear. Was he an accomplice, or merely an opportunist? As the fete wound down, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the widow's confession turning in her mind. The unveiled Mrs. Crane had revealed more than her face. She had exposed a piece of the puzzle. The limping man was no phantom, but a tangible threat, likely the author of the cryptic letter. Yet Miss Marple suspected the chalice's return was not the end of the matter. She thought of her friend Dolly Bantry, who loved to speculate about motives over tea, but Miss Marple knew motives were often simpler than they appeared. Greed, fear, or a desire for control. Mrs. Crane's fear was genuine, but Edwin's involvement suggested a deeper game. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the anonymous letter before her. She would need to act soon, before the limping man or Edwin made their next move. A plan began to form, one that would require Colonel Bantry's authority and Dr. Haydock's discretion. She would propose a trap, using Mrs. Crane's cooperation to draw the culprits into the open. For now, she picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly, each stitch a step closer to the truth. Little Paddocks might revel in its fate, but Miss Marple knew the real drama was yet to unfold. Chapter 7. The trap is sprung. The moon hung low over Little Paddocks, its silver light filtering through the bare branches of the churchyard yews. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a dark shawl, stood hidden behind one such tree, her breath steady despite the chill in the air. The village slept, its cottages dark save for the occasional flicker of a lamp. But the churchyard was alive with anticipation. Tonight, Miss Marple had set a trap, and she waited, as patient as her knitting needles, for the players to take their places. The plan had been carefully devised that morning, over tea with Colonel Henry Bantry and Dr. Philip Haydock at the Colonel's sturdy oak table. Miss Marple, her voice soft but resolute, had shared her suspicions. Limping Man, likely a figure from Mrs. Crane's past, was blackmailing her, using the chalice theft as a ploy to unsettle her. Edwin Turner, the ambitious clerk, was entangled in the scheme, perhaps as an accomplice or an opportunist exploiting the widow's vulnerability. "We need proof," she had said, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "A rumour, carefully spread, will draw them out." Colonel Bantry, his military instincts roused, had agreed to help. Dr. Haydock, with his quiet pragmatism, had nodded, though his concern for Mrs. Crane was evident. The rumour was simple but potent. Mrs. Crane, weary of threats, would hand over a substantial sum to her blackmailer at midnight in the churchyard, near the hollow tree where the chalice had been found. Miss Marple had visited Willow Cottage that afternoon, finding Mrs. Crane pale but resolute. "I'll do whatever you ask," the widow had said, her unveiled face etched with determination. "I want this to end." Miss Marple had patted her hand, sensing truth in her words but noting the lingering fear in her eyes. Now, as the church clock struck 11:30, Miss Marple's senses sharpened. The churchyard was silent, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. She had chosen her hiding place with care, the yew's dense branches offering cover while affording a clear view of the hollow tree. Colonel Bantry and Dr. Haydock waited nearby, concealed behind the church's stone wall, ready to act when the moment came. Mrs. Crane, under strict instructions, remained at Willow Cottage, her absence ensuring her safety and the trap's credibility. At midnight, a figure emerged from the shadows of the lane. It was Edwin Turner, his slicked hair glinting faintly under the moonlight, his movements furtive but purposeful. He carried a small satchel, its weight suggesting something more than papers. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The clerk's presence confirmed her suspicions, but his role, blackmailer or intermediary, remained unclear. He paused by the hollow tree, glancing about, his hands fidgeting with the satchel strap. Moments later, another figure approached, his gait uneven, the telltale limp marking him as the man in the dark coat. His hat was pulled low, but Miss Marple noted the tense set of his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his pocket, as if ready for confrontation. The two men met, their voices low but carrying in the still night. "You've got the money," the limping man growled, his tone rough with impatience. Edwin's reply was sharp. "It's here, but you'd better hold up your end, Grayson. She's not to be trifled with." Miss Marple's mind seized on the name. Grayson. A piece of the puzzle slotted into place. This was the man from Mrs. Crane's past, the one she had fled London to escape. Edwin's words suggested he was no mere bystander, but a conspirator, using his access to Mrs. Crane's legal affairs to exploit her fear. The satchel, she suspected, contained not money but a ruse, perhaps papers or a prop to lure Grayson into the open. The argument grew heated. "You think you can double-cross me?" Grayson hissed, stepping closer. "I know what her husband hid, and I'll have my share, or the whole village will know." Edwin's laugh was brittle. "You'll get nothing if you don't keep quiet. The chalice was my idea, and it worked. She's scared stiff." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The chalice theft, then, was a deliberate act, orchestrated to pressure Mrs. Crane into compliance. But what was the share Grayson sought, and what had her husband hidden? Before the exchange could escalate further, Colonel Bantry's voice rang out, authoritative and clear. "That's enough, gentlemen." He stepped from behind the wall, his silhouette imposing in the moonlight, with Dr. Haydock at his side. Grayson froze, then bolted towards the lane, but the doctor, surprisingly swift, cut him off, grabbing his arm. Edwin, caught off guard, dropped the satchel and raised his hands, his face pale. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, but the colonel's stern gaze silenced him. Miss Marple emerged from her hiding place, her shawl blending with the shadows. "I think, Mr. Turner," she said quietly, "there's little misunderstanding here." She turned to Grayson, whose hat had fallen in the scuffle, revealing a gaunt face lined with desperation. "And you, Mr. Grayson, have been troubling Mrs. Crane for some time, I believe." The man's eyes darted, but he said nothing, his silence as damning as a confession. At the vicarage, where the culprits were taken under Colonel Bantry's supervision, the truth unravelled. Edwin, flushed with shame, admitted to stealing the chalice to frighten Mrs. Crane, hoping to pressure her into paying to keep her husband's shady dealings secret. Grayson, her late husband's former business partner, had tracked her to Little Paddocks, demanding a share of an illicit fortune Charles Crane had hidden before his death. The anonymous letter, Grayson confessed, was his attempt to unnerve her further, written in a moment of spite. The satchel, opened by the colonel, contained forged documents meant to convince Grayson of a payout that never existed. Mrs. Crane, summoned to the vicarage, listened in silence, her face a mask of relief and exhaustion. "I only wanted peace," she said, her voice low. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the fire, offered a gentle smile. "Peace will come, my dear. The truth has a way of clearing the air." As Grayson and Edwin were led away to face the magistrate's judgment, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the simplicity of human motives, greed and fear, so often at the heart of such schemes. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, the churchyard now quiet under the moon. The trap had worked, but her satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that human frailty was never fully resolved. She thought of her nephew Raymond, who would no doubt find the tale thrilling. But to Miss Marple, it was merely another pattern, unravelled stitch by stitch. She picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their rhythm, as Little Paddocks settled into the stillness of a mystery solved. Chapter 8. The quiet of Little Paddocks. The morning sun rose gently over Little Paddocks, bathing the village in a soft golden glow that seemed to erase the shadows of the past weeks. The church spire gleamed, the hedgerows sparkled with dew, and the air carried the faint sweetness of late autumn roses. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm, as she gazed out at the tranquil scene. The events of the churchyard trap had settled like dust after a storm, and the village was returning to its quiet routines. Though Miss Marple knew that beneath its calm surface, human nature would always stir. Mrs. Lavinia Crane, no longer veiled, had begun to emerge from Willow Cottage, her presence at the village shop or the Sunday service no longer a cause for whispers. The revelation of her husband's illicit dealings and the blackmail that had followed her to Little Paddocks had softened the villagers' curiosity into something like sympathy. She had called on Miss Marple the previous day, her face unshadowed by fear for the first time. "I can breathe again," she had said, her voice steady. "I owe you so much, Miss Marple." Miss Marple had waved away the gratitude with a gentle smile. "Nonsense, my dear. I only listened, and people do talk, you know." Edwin Turner and the limping man, Grayson, had been taken to the county magistrate, their fates now in the hands of sterner authority. Edwin's confession had laid bare his greed, his attempt to exploit Mrs. Crane's secrets for profit, while Grayson's desperation had driven him to threats and intimidation. The chalice, returned to the vicarage, gleamed once more in its velvet-lined box, a symbol of the village's restored order. Yet Miss Marple, sipping her tea, knew that order was fragile, easily disrupted by the next ripple of ambition or fear. At tea with Mrs. Lucy Adams that afternoon, the talk was of lighter things: plans for the Christmas bazaar, the vicar's new sermon series. But Miss Marple's friend could not resist a final reflection on the affair. "To think it was all about money," Lucy said, shaking her head as she passed the biscuits. "Greed and fear, Jane. Such tiresome motives." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Tiresome, yes, but so very common. People are predictable, Lucy, if you watch closely." She took a biscuit, her thoughts drifting to her friend Dolly Bantry, who would relish the tale, but miss its deeper truth. That motives, however base, were the threads that bound every mystery. The village green, so recently alive with the fate's bustle, was quiet now, its grass trodden but recovering. Miss Marple, walking home, paused to admire the hollow tree where the chalice had been hidden. It stood as a silent witness to the drama, its gnarled roots a reminder that secrets, like roots, often lay hidden beneath the surface. She thought of the anonymous letter, its cryptic warning now explained, and of Mrs. Crane's unveiled face, no longer a mask, but a window to a woman seeking peace. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by her fire, the evening light fading into dusk. The anonymous letter rested in a drawer, its purpose served, but she had no need to revisit it. The puzzle was complete, its pieces, chalice, veil, limping stranger, ambitious clerk, fitted together with the clarity of a finished pattern. She recalled her nephew Raymond's fondness for detective stories, with their dramatic flourishes, but Miss Marple preferred the quiet satisfaction of truth uncovered. No veil could hide from her sharp eyes, no shadow could obscure the motives she knew so well. As the church clock chimed 7, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the grey wool soft beneath her fingers. The needles clicked, each stitch a small triumph of order over chaos. Little Paddocks might sleep soundly tonight, its secrets laid bare, But Miss Marple knew that other mysteries would come, as inevitable as the turning seasons. For now, she was content to knit, to watch, and to wait. An unassuming figure in a village that underestimated her at its peril.